You're listening to the Educate, Enable and Empower Show, a podcast from the Scottish Women's Development Forum, in which we sit down with inspiring women and others to listen to their stories, life lessons and perspectives.
My name is Mo Boyle and I produce the Educate, Enable and Empower podcast. In this podcast, Jenny Stewart and Colette Turpey sit down with Director of People and Development, Katy Miller.
Welcome to Breaking Barriers, a special episode in honour of International Women's Day, where we're embracing the theme of inspiring inclusion. Today, we're joined by the Director of People and Development, Katy Miller. You have responsible for an extensive portfolio within Police Scotland, and I'm going to list them. This is how many there are. People health and wellbeing, recruitment, promotion and selection, employee relations and reward, people, engagement, partnering, leadership and talent, equality, diversity and inclusion. You began your career in human resources, having graduated from the University of Greenwich in London, and prior to joining Police Scotland in February of last year, you've held a number of senior leadership roles within professional and financial services organisations, including the FTSE 100 companies as well. And laterally, you've worked in local government as Service Director, Human Resources at the City of Edinburgh Council. You have a vast amount of experience in human resources and have successfully led on significant programmes and initiatives driving cultural and organisational reform and change, and have held responsibility for the development and delivery of people strategies and strategic workforce plans. You've also held a number of board positions in non-profit, health and pension organisations and are a Fellow of the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development. Director Miller, thank you for joining us.
Good to join you. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, I should caveat, you always say to me to call you Katy. So we're going to do just that throughout this podcast. But we've had conversations about this before. And the traditional thought process, of course, of a rank-based organisation reigns strong within our policing culture. Command and control-based leadership. It has its place, absolutely, in ongoing and dynamic incidents. But tell me a little bit about why you feel strongly about being called by your name in this organisation.
It's a very good question. So spot on in terms of there's always a time and a place, I think, for the formality, for the ranks. But equally, I think we need to recognise as an organisation the time and the space for informality. And actually why that's important for me is we talk about building relationships within organisations. And in order to do that, I am a firm believer in terms of the firm footing of a conversation. So status, egos out of room, actually it is about how you can interact with people, bring the best out of people. And for me personally, I always say to my team as well, it's Katy. So it's important for me. And actually in previous organisations, I've gone further and actually even asked people not to use their job titles on emails. And therefore, actually what you find is that escalation of people wanting to understand the status or the rank or the position that people are talking to. Actually, that just takes it all away.
Yeah. And, I would agree with you. I've worked on a couple of initiatives within the police where we've actually held a flat hierarchy, and the collaboration has just been phenomenal. So no, thank you for explaining it. And yes, I will call you Katy. So you're the most senior female member of police staff in Police Scotland, and the journey that I read out in your biography has clearly been both inspiring and enlightening. Can you share with us a bit about your career path, especially your transition from private sector roles to the City of Edinburgh Council and then finally to Police Scotland?
It wasn't until I read what you'd written on the piece of paper that I'd reflected on the fact that I was the most senior female member of staff. I actually hadn't recognised that. So I think in terms of, my career, I never had an aspiration in terms of roles, organisations, status. I was a bit of a late starter going to university. So I was 23, 24 when I started at university. I'd been working for a while. And actually, I didn't go to study HR. I went to study something completely differently. And I had one module in my degree, which was around trade unions. And I enjoyed it so much, I actually switched and took HR as my major. And that really, for the first time for me, that I started to get really curious about cultures and organisation and people in organisations. When I graduated, I was living in London and I actually took a job with a bank. And if I'm being honest, there wasn't much consideration behind that, other than it was a really good fit into a good organisation, a good branded organisation, if I could call it that. And it was really an entry-level HR role. And I stayed within financial services for a while. At the point of having my first child, it started to, I started to question a little bit more about what I wanted to do with my career. I moved to France for a little bit. In fact, that's where my middle child was born. She does not speak French. And so I lived in France for a little while and actually spent time balancing work and building up renovating a farmhouse. So I learned how to do plastering, and we did all sorts of wonderful things for a year and a half. And then when we came to leave France, there was a decision point about location and where to move. And we decided to move to Scotland. So it was almost kind of 20 years ago. And I took a job again in financial services, probably because that's all I knew. And at that point in time, after about 8-9 years, I really started to feel more about kind of what's my sense of purpose? Where do I feel that I flourish? What's the type of culture? What's the difference I wanted to make to organizations? And actually, in my last role in financial services, I spent a good 6 months or so working with a coach on almost trying to build up the courage to move from financial services into a different sector. And it was really the first job that came up at City of Edinburgh Council that I thought, I just feel a real pull to that. I feel a pull to the sense of purpose, but knew that I had a huge learning curve. I mean, it's completely different from private sector. So worked with some of the most amazing colleagues. I properly found inspiration from what the kind of purpose of public sector. And I guess then, when the job came up at Police Scotland, I mean, wow, what an organisation. It has its challenges, but it has so much opportunity as well. And I kind of keep on all the time. I come back to what my purpose is, and maybe we'll get onto that in a little bit. But actually, that's the draw for me for every role or organisation now.
So, Katy, you did talk there about inspiring colleagues. Have you had any inspiring role models through your time in your career? And who were they and what inspired you from them? So
I have one particular individual who was an HR director in one of my first roles in Scotland. And I distinctly remember walking into the boardroom at one point and really recognising for the first time that she was the only female that was sitting around that table. And not only that, but observing the conversations around the table and the dynamics. And that HR director is somebody who I still remain friends with. I still use her as a mentor. I will still turn to her, and she's just somebody for me who, not only in terms of seniority, but actually just the ethics that she has always demonstrated and the resilience in the roles that she has. She's done some amazing stuff, and I'd call out her name. It's Kate Guthrie. So she's my go-to person.
Brilliant. And you did mention there as well about mentoring, and that's something that's very passionate for myself. So could you tell me about your experiences of mentoring? Now, this could be as a mentor or a mentee or reverse mentoring, and what value did you find in learning through others' lived experiences?
So I've always had a mentor, and it tends to be somebody from out with HR, and it will be somebody that I always turn to at those points where you sometimes can't quite find a way through things, or you want to bounce something off in a really secure, safe space. So I think the role of a mentor, particularly perhaps as you do get more senior, is really important. It can feel quite isolated in some of our roles, perhaps we'll get onto, but sometimes in HR as well, with the type of things that we deal with. I also have mentored individuals. So actually I'm mentoring somebody at the moment who's on a CIPD program who aspires to be an HR director. So just talking to her a little bit about my experience of moving, not only across sectors, but also in terms of kind of up the career ladder, if you want to call it that. And I do have a reverse mentor as well. So I worked with a social worker who was my mentor at City of Edinburgh Council. And she was a children's social worker with children with additional learning needs. And I learned so much from her, not only in terms of how she perceived the leadership team and that kind of, how it felt in the organization, but also just about the dynamics of the organization and some of the decisions that we might make either as an HR director or as an executive, but actually how it really feels for colleagues. It is a grounding conversation to have with somebody.
Yeah, I think certainly for me, like yourself, I've done all three. I've been a mentor, I've been a mentee, but I've also been involved in reverse mentoring. And as you say, it's that different perspective that it brings. It's almost a light bulb moment, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So, Katy, throughout your career, through your progression, you must have faced challenge at some point. What kind of barriers have you faced? And can you tell us a little bit more about how you've managed to overcome them?
And do you know what? It's only really, I'm going to say in the last 10 years or so that I've reflected on this. I tend to be somebody who gets my head down. I've got a task, I kind of move forward. And it's only as I've learned more about the nuances of culture and taking time to look at both the academic side of culture, but also in reality, how you see it work in organizations. And I've talked before, and I always come back to this model that I particularly like, which is kind of three lenses of culture. So one around the express culture of an organization. What do you see that's written? How do we write policies? What are the pictures up on the walls? All of those very tangible things. The other bit then is the lived part of a culture. So despite what you might express in a policy, what's the lived experience for colleagues of that? Or what's the lived experience when you walk into a room? Where are people sat? What's the protocol? How are agendas, written, and what's the language we use as an organization? And then the third lens is the shadow culture. And actually that piece about, you might be sitting in a room and you can see your express culture and your lived culture, but the shadow culture of where somebody's hesitating to ask something or to say something because of whatever it might be, what's holding back. So it's only really as I've started to think about organizations through those three lenses and become really fascinated on the shadow culture in organizations. And perhaps in my earlier career, my focus would have been more on the express culture. So what are the employment policies we write? Really important. But actually what's more important is the lived and the shadow culture that either bring the policies to life or actually create a really detrimental impact on the organisation.
Yeah, and I think especially in policing, it's trying to break that cycle of those shadow cultures. Now, it's not just policing, of course, all organisations have them, but must be particularly interesting, especially for you coming from that different background. And it is a bit of a challenge within policing. How do you see us as an organisation breaking those shadow cultures?
And I do think it is every organisation. So I don't think there's any organisation that can turn around and say that they've got this right, and that we should always be aspiring to improve and to challenge ourselves. I think thinking about the shadow culture, particularly within policing, and I kind of have this view. I remember back in in the kind of early 2000s when financial services, there was a lot of scrutiny, and I can remember people saying there's some pretty bad practices that probably played out in the press. But I always remember thinking, I want to be part of trying to bring about the change and the solution. I don't want to be somebody sat on the outside criticising and, tutting. If you think there's an issue, then get yourself in there and try and help fix it. And I guess, policing, I know policing colleagues as friends and, in a professional sense, what I always come back to is that sense of purpose. And it is the bit that is unique to a public sector, I think, but also B, to policing. No one else, except for police forces, can share that sense of purpose. It is unique and it's our unique selling point. And if you think about financial services, I know, and if anybody, ex-colleagues listen to this from financial services, they will talk about a sense of purpose. But I will say it is never as pure, it's never as true as a public sector one.
Yeah, and it brings us nicely into values. And you kind of touched on that, one of your first answers, about values about purpose. What are your personal values? Why are they important? And how do you reflect them as an individual?
Oof, good question. So I have 3 values, and by coincidence, they begin with C. All right, this was not planned. This isn't like Katie's 3 C's. And actually, I worked with these on my coach as I was kind of transitioning from financial sector to public sector. So the first one is commitment. And perhaps I've touched on it there that, I feel fully committed. I don't want to join a role or an organisation and have 1 foot in it and 1 foot outside of it. So there's a difference there for me about if you're committed, both feet are in and you're here. So that's my first one, is commitment. And that's not only to role, but that's also to people. It's to the difference I want to make. So in its broadest sense. The second one then for me is courage. And I've really had to grow into this because it's one that I've grappled with. And perhaps it is a little bit about, I suppose, kind of moving up in terms of seniority and being a woman and having a woman's voice at a table. And it's probably, the one that for me, I really still have to work at. Mm-hmm. And the other one for me is curiosity. I never want to lose my curiosity. I never want to be somebody that says, we've done enough, we can't improve, or what's somebody else doing, or, what could not, what's the best practice? It's that continual learning for me. And I kind of, for me, I always want to push myself and my team to be curious. So those are the 3 for me: commitment, courage, and curiosity.
So I'm interested in the courage because you're, as we discussed, the most senior female police staff member of our workforce. Do you mean imposter syndrome? Have you had, it's really, really interesting for me to talk about that when you were talking about senior leadership. So a lot of our members in the SWDF talk about imposter syndrome in their everyday. Is that something that you mean by courage?
Absolutely, imposter syndrome does come in. It does. And in part, for me, part of that is the fact that, I didn't follow a traditional route. I didn't finish school. So I kind of finished before my A-levels, which, obviously an English thing, you can tell from my accent. I then took time out. So I didn't go back to university till I was, a mature, small M student. So, there's always that bit of me that, I had some amazingly clever, intellectual colleagues. And in the earlier part of my career, there was that bit about never quite feeling good enough in that space. Where I've gotten to now probably in my life is embrace that space. Use the colleagues around you to learn and actually to play from strengths with people. So, but imposter syndrome definitely is, and it's still there, in different situations, it will still come to the forefront. And then that for me is, having worked with a coach and with mentor about how do you just quieten that voice down. And I suppose one of the biggest pieces that I've learned is to always come back to my own sense of purpose. And is what I'm doing still aligned to that? And if I didn't show courage, I wouldn't have that alignment. And I feel when it's out of alignment. And that's the bit that pulls me back.
And I think a lot of people can relate. I can relate to that as well. It's really, really difficult to quieten that voice that you talk about. But thank you for sharing that.
Diversity and inclusion are critical in any organisation, but particularly in policing. It affects our workforce and our communities. We are, of course, still striving to get it right for both. The statement by Sir Ian Livingston, our former Chief Constable last year on institutional discrimination, demonstrates how we need to be better. Part of your portfolio in EDI, how does Police Scotland approach this, and are there any lessons that can be learned from other sectors?
This is a big question. It's a big topic. So listen, I hope that I'm going to do this justice, and maybe I might skim the surface on some of it, and at later opportunities we can deep dive into a little bit. I come back to the fact that cultural and our intent around culture is so important. And there's one piece, isn't there, around the intent, so your expressed culture, and then this other piece about, your lived and shadow culture. And I guess when we talk about inclusion, it is about that individual experience. So that individual lived experience. And it is only that individual that can describe and own that narrative and that story. And actually, as an organisation, to be able to hear that without judgment, without fear, and without critiquing it, is really important. I think that, for Police Scotland, there's so much opportunity. And I think now the fact that we are having conversations about things that perhaps weren't talked about in the same way before, it kind of opens the door. We might not have all the answers. I might not get all my language right. Even in my role, I will make mistakes. I don't have the same lived experience. I don't have the same knowledge in areas of ED&I as other people, but I want to have the conversation with people. I want to learn. I want to understand what it's like. If I have a frustration, it's that we can't get to it quick enough. You want change to happen more quickly. And we'll know that cultural change, A, to happen, but B, to embed and be sustained is a massive piece for us. And that for me is the bit that I always come back to. So it's huge. I think that we are now talking about it, but I think there's a long way to go. I think in terms of, HR and some of what we have, we need to demystify some of this. And a lot of this is about conversation. There's a big piece for us, or for me, I think, about our brand. And I don't mean our brand in terms of Police Scotland and etc. But how do we sit in the market for candidates? What do people say when you say, I'm going to apply for a job at Police Scotland? Or what are people thinking when they see a job vacancy come up and you see it's got Police Scotland, it's within our organisation? And that for me is a fascinating piece about what's the narrative externally as well as internally, but externally about us as an organisation. What I do think is that we're moving to a place of commitment around changing it. And I come back to one of my earlier remarks about the difference between people saying, yes, 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 I get it. They've got one foot in and they've got one foot out. When somebody's truly committed to that cultural change, both their feet are in and they are absolutely behind it. And that's the hard bit, to move people to proper advocacy and support.
I think that, some of the points that you touched upon there, I think over my last 18 years in this organisation, the change and the pace at change has been phenomenal, especially in the last, let's say, 5 years, even in the last year. You talk about brand. Our best brand ambassadors are our workforce. And I think if we can get it right, we talk to our members in the SWDF, and, we know as an organisation that at times we're not getting it right for those individuals. So of course we will keep advocating and pushing for our membership. But I'm heartened to hear that, it is understood. As we've spoken to the Chief Constable, we've spoken to DCC Connors as well as yourself for these podcasts. And I do have hope for the future, but we do have a long way to go for some people and some of our members that come to us with their individual stories, as you had said, their perceptions on inclusion. So how important is it in all of this to have a diverse leadership in Police Scotland?
Well, you have to. I mean, I just, it's not even debatable. I don't think, in this sitting here in 2024, that there shouldn't be a question as to whether or not diversity, A, at leadership, but B, throughout the organisation. For me, it's a given. I think that the piece, particularly for the executive, and obviously I don't know what the Chief Constable or Dep Connors has said, but actually the bit for me is about recognising the collegiate leadership that's required. So it is that piece around being clear about our values, but also standing behind those values. And we don't always get it right. I know there will be people, whether in this role or in previous roles, that will say you didn't, and that will always be the case. However, there's a piece here for me about when we get it wrong, we say we've got it wrong and we learn from it. No organisation is ever going to get this right. It's a learning process, and by its nature, then there will be mistakes we make. But it is that learning bit for me, and I think one of the pieces that I come back to is taking employment policy, which obviously is something I'm passionate about. There's a piece here for me as an organisation in how much investment we put in developing and writing a policy versus how much investment we put in embedding it. And that for me is the bit where actually we've got a long way to go. So, whether that's policy or practice, whether it's around promotions or recruitment, etc., It's around the practice of it. What are the conversations that we have? What's that lived experience? How quickly are we getting back to candidates? Are they left in the dark? If they've put a lot of time into applying for a job, what's the feedback they get from us? It's all of those kind of what we used to call in a previous organization magic moments, but moments that really matter to people. So even if you haven't been successful in getting a job, somebody's spent the time to sit down with you and explain why that is. And then there's learning from that, from the organization, but also from the individual to take forward.
Yeah, and I think I'll put it down to, it's like that bad restaurant review, that if you have, bad meal, you go and you tell 10 people about it, how awful it was. But actually, even if, you might not have been successful, but if you have a really good experience about it, it wouldn't be that. And I think communication is key, but it is difficult in a workforce of 22,000.
It is and it isn't. So I don't think we could hide behind the complexity argument. I think that, you have organizations that are operating globally, that operate multi-languages, multi-cultures and multi-countries, different time zones. I break it down and I think we have complex services and vital services, but actually we're all based in Scotland. We can all reach each other within a day or so's travel. It's possible for us to network and to get to know each other and to break down silos. So I'm kind of jury's out on that one, but I'm still learning about Police Scotland. So that's my caveat. There you go.
So our podcast, Breaking Barriers, is a special series for International Women's Day. And this year, of course, the theme is inspiring inclusion. And in terms of inspiration, how do you see your role influencing and empowering other women in Police Scotland?
Well, whether it's about my role or about me as an individual, I'll come back to my purpose, which is around, the creation of cultures to help people to flourish, to be the very best they can be, And actually, if there's, even when my time with Police Scotland comes to an end, whenever that might be, if I can reflect and look back and think about moments where I have helped individuals to feel that sense of fulfillment, to feel that sense that they have actually been in an environment that has helped them flourish. And when I say flourish, I don't just mean in work. I'm talking about your whole life, because the demarcation is fairly narrow, isn't it, in terms of work life, etc. So that for me actually is the point around, whether or not I've inspired people. It's not so much, as I say, about the rank or the grade. Different things are important to different people, but it is that bit, I come back, culture and how we get to that point where people genuinely feel they've been given that parity, that equity of opportunity to flourish, whatever that might look like for them.
And that might look like being able to call someone in a rank organisation by their first name.
It might well be, yes. Yeah. I think that, as I said, I'm learning about policing and I have a huge respect for what officers need to do and how that needs to look. And I'll never know that in a way an officer will, so I can't pretend to. But what I do know is that the value, I think, in organisations of having space for informality is really important. And not just informality in terms of how we address each other or what, but informality for discussion. If you look back where organisations perhaps have failed, and some of them, pretty badly, one of the key pieces of research that keeps on coming through is that bit to be able to create safe space for constructive challenge and questioning. And actually without that, you end up with just kind of one or two voices kind of controlling not only the organisational direction, but the culture and the footprint of that culture, and it closes voices out. And you can see that, in so many examples. So that bit of informality for me, if I can call it that, perhaps with a small I, is where we have boards which have a formal tone to them, but a board should be a place where we can challenge the papers that are coming forward. It shouldn't just be that I've kind of taken it to board and it's a tick box and that's it, moved through. So it's that balance for me.
So leadership is sometimes a really difficult thing to get right. We've all experienced bad leaders, but when you have a great leader, it can become a game changer. Everyone has their unique style. Can you give us an insight into your leadership style, philosophy, and how your career journey has shaped it?
I suspect that those that have met me since I've joined Police Scotland have got a bit of a sense of me as a person. We talk about authentic leadership, and actually that's really hard to get right, isn't it? Because there are always times where you're challenged in particular situations around that. For me, leadership has to keep on coming back to this piece that, I might be in a particular position, but I have to earn the right to stay in that position. It's not just a given now, So it's that continual push for me. I read a really good book, probably about 15 years ago or so, but I come back to it, which was a guy called Steve Radcliffe, who talks about the modes of leadership and actually where you spend your time in kind of supervisory, managerial versus where you spend your time in kind of leadership space. And it's something that I always go back to. And I think one of the biggest challenges is in busy roles, which we all have, is getting pulled back into a space where actually you don't have enough space to get to some of the thinking that's really important as an organization. And that creates an opportunity to trust your team. And trust is a big thing, I think, when you're a leader, particularly kind of sprinkle that with some imposter syndrome, where, you might want to be more in control of things so that, you feel that confidence perhaps from that. But actually, to be able to get to a position where you can trust and empower your team is absolutely critical. There's no one person that can do a job in isolation. And I, by any stretch of the imagination, have people in my team who are far better at me than parts of HR. Absolutely. It's the sum of the total for me. So my leadership style is one of seeking to try and empower. It is one where, where I talk about genuinely wanting voices at the table. I want voices at the table. I want them to be constructive and ideally come from a place of positive intent. But it's so important to have that. So I come back to trying to be authentic and continue to ground myself. In fact, when I get home, my children will quite often question how I have the job I have, just because of who I am and how I am at home with them. So I am quite an informal person by my nature. There's obviously moments of formality, but I get a huge amount from discussion and input from other people. It's that kind of introvert extrovert, isn't it? I'm an introvert in many situations, but when it comes to wanting to seek views, it's that kind of satellite dish of, needing all of the information coming in. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but there you go.
Oh, yes, you have. No, that's great. Thank you.
I'm quite curious about, you talked a couple of things there that kind of resonated with me about ensuring, I suppose, that there's not an echo chamber. We don't want that for our leaders when you're seeking opinions, positive intent, as you said, but we're seeking different perspectives on that. But also just interested to hear your thoughts before we move on to the next question about failure, having the sort of that ability as a leader to empower your team that it's okay to fail, but you make it quick. Because certainly for me, at the beginning of my career, failure was just, if you failed, there was no allowance for that, which was difficult. And that has changed with me as a leader as well, because I think that's how you learn.
Yeah. How have you seen that change for you?
Well, for me, because I've gone into a leadership position, and it's that it is okay to fail and learn, fail fast, as I would say to my team. But I just remember at the beginning that no, it wasn't okay to fail, and you did what, and it is that really negative experience. So when Colette there was talking about bad leaders, we've all had those bad leaders. But see, when you get a fantastic leader, that's who I would model myself on. I'll always remember the bad leaders to say, I will never, ever be like that individual. I think because policing's changed in the last 2 decades, that it's in a good way. It has changed in leadership style. So I've very much was taught one thing, but I have evolved through my own experiences for failure. So just interested to hear your thoughts on failure.
So there's not we will always fail at one point, won't we? As much as we might not like that, it's a fact. And whether that's at work, at home, personal lives, etc., is part of human life. And so I have a similar philosophy to you, that if you think that something is going to fail, call it. It's not that kind of slow death of still trying to persevere with something. Just call it, but call it in a way that actually is honest. It's true. So a number of organizations I've worked in will have points of failure, but we'll try and wrap it up into something. And actually, I think that honesty as an organization to recognize when something fails and why, and to take the learning from it is the important bit, so that actually, next time we try, we understand, is really important. I think on a personal level, it's really hard, isn't it? Because you feel like you're in the spotlight, and it can feel very personal as well. And it can feel that, if you're somebody who has imposter syndrome, the voices can go into overdrive about, what is it that people are saying about you? What's the conversation that's happening in the organization? When I walk into a room, what's the chat people have had? And actually, it's being able to recognize what's important to you, to learn from, to be honest about, and to somehow have tools and techniques that just close off the unhelpful conversation in your head, and actually just think about how you move forward then. So it's part and parcel of human nature. I'm sure I've had some technical term humdingers in my career. Can't say that, can I? You might need to edit that. But, some absolute howlers in my career, when you look back. And actually, sometimes it's not even things that have happened on a public platform, so to speak, but it might be in individual conversations I've had with somebody. And I reflect on it and I think, what's the impact I've left there? And I might not see it in the moment, but I reflect back and think, oh, Katy, you could have done that differently.
But the very fact that you're a reflector, clearly, but the very fact that you're reflecting shows that at least, for some leaders, they wouldn't reflect on that. So it's interesting that you're saying that, well, you're thinking, how do I do better next time? Or how can I go back and do better with that conversation?
Yeah. And that's difficult, isn't it? Because you take the learning on board, but habits are habits, aren't they? And they're really hard to break. And, particularly around some traits. And actually, I think a reflection as well, having moved sectors, is that what's gone before and that's been successful in my career doesn't always work in other organizations. So I've had to unpick that and relearn what success might look like in different organizations.
That's fascinating. Yeah. And we were talking about it's International Women's Day, and the Scottish Women's Development Forum is, of course, we advocate for the advancement and the rights of women within Police Scotland and the Scottish Police Authority. What advice would you offer to women aspiring to leadership roles in policing? And in fact, if we say not even leadership, but just aspiring to develop within our organisation?
Come back to a mentor. Find somebody. You don't need to do it formally. You can just pick somebody out. What I have found since I've joined, that I've really, really loved about the organisation, a door has never been closed. So whenever I've approached somebody and said, what's this acronym? What is it you do in that division? Or what does this look like? I've never had anybody say to me, sorry, I haven't got time, or I can't believe you're asking that. So I would encourage you to look at doors are open. Just find the door, knock on it, go for a cup of coffee, explore, have some good conversations. And whether it's within Police Scotland or outside, network. And I don't mean network necessarily for advancement or, that kind of personal PR bit, but there's so many amazing people out there. So in fact, there's a guy, I'll name him, called Perry Timms, who's been named HR's most influential person. He has the most amazing mind. Like, he's creative in a way I could never be. And over Christmas, he'd put something up on LinkedIn and I just loved it. Like, I felt this buzz of energy about it. So I sent him a message through LinkedIn, and then he sent me a message. We'd never met in person. And I just thought, what an amazing person to somehow coerce to be in my network. And do you know what? We ended up having a Teams meeting last week. And from his perspective, I didn't know this until we started talking. He wanted to try and find somebody that he could work with, not in a commercial way, but to test out some of his thinking and actually how would it land in reality in an organization. And here I am thinking, I need some creativity to help me and kind of ignite me. So we found this mutual space where now we've now got our next call set up and we're starting to bounce voice messages off each other and, what could this look like? So, wherever you are, whatever your role, whatever level you're at, grade, status, however you want to define it, just make the ask. People say yes.
So as a member of police staff myself, Katy, I'd really like to focus on police staff's career progression. And what does that look like in your vision for the future of Police Scotland? We know police officers have an obvious career path through leadership and the rank structure, but it appears to be a wee bit more difficult for police staff. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Thank you, Colette. Something I've been grappling with, actually, because when I joined Police Scotland, I hadn't really thought about the roles that officers would have. And I know that sounds a little naive, but you tend to think about officers being in policing capital P roles. And it's only really, in my first kind of couple of weeks, few months of onboarding, that actually that picture started to come to life. And I think I will go on record and say that I do think that we have more to do in the staff space. There's always more to do in the officer space as well. Please don't hear me wrong. But actually, we've got the foundations for officers in place. We've got the foundations. I know there's more to do, but around, promotions and, a lot of the development that sits alongside that. For staff, we're actually fairly silent, I think, is the reality. And it's not for me then about kind of bringing officer down. It's about rising staff up so that it feels that we're both on that kind of parity and equal footing. So I think it's difficult at the moment. We've obviously got voluntary redundancy. We know that from a staff perspective, we need to shrink the size of our pay bill for 24-25. We know that as an organisation for 25-26, we don't know what the budget's going to look like, but it's getting very tight across all public sector. And I think we need to be prepared in thinking about that as an organisation and thinking then about what are the areas that we need to downsize, right size, upsize. And when I say areas, I mean capabilities. And then start to think about what's the pathing, what's the development that we put in place to help people make informed decisions about what those capabilities and the development for them might look like. I think as an organisation, we could be more prominent, if I can put it that way, on perhaps kind of performance goals, conversations, feedback, one-to-ones, etc. That actually, yes, it's really important you have one-to-ones where you're getting to know people and you're understanding about what's going on for them in their life, where are they at with their well-being, what can you do to support them, but equally what the needs of the organisation are. And actually starting to think about how we align with more strength the work that people are doing and perhaps the objectives and what we're delivering and how that's aligned strategically. So I think it's an exciting area, despite the challenges we have around our kind of pay bill. It's an exciting area where, in 2 years' time, I would hope that, we'll have a really clear plan for our staff mapped out. There's some great, great jobs here. I mean, as an employer, it has a fantastic diversity on offer of roles for staff.
And in the similar vein, for officers, over the last few years, we've seen recruitment of women within policing in Scotland steadily increase to about 32%, I think, from last year. I think when I joined, it was like 18%, which is it's incredible. But we know when we hear from our members within the SWDF that there's still barriers that exist when it comes to recruitment, retention, and the progression of women within this organisation. I think there was a recent report that's just come out for England and Wales. I think it was Dr. Sarah Chapman around recruitment, progression and retention. And within that paper, they talked about, organisational inflexibility. How are we tackling this problem and taking what is a traditionally and structurally discriminatory system, now Sirian coined that last year, to an end state, the future that we all want to see with organisational flexibility, especially for women.
Yeah, and actually, so thinking about organisational flexibility, let's roll back 4 years pre-COVID. And even thinking about, what that looked like then for a number of roles, perhaps less so for officers, but, certainly for staff. If we tried to map out, if somebody had said, we want to get to a point where we're going to go from, Monday to Friday in an office-based environment to hybrid working, we would have had a project plan that was about 60,000 lines deep, and it would have taken us 2.5, 3 years to get to, a start of that is the reality. That happened in the space of kind of 2 weeks for most organisations. So whilst it might have felt chaotic for a number of us that were kind of involved in that, what that does show me is that if there's a burning platform, organisations can change very quickly. So I think with regards to officers, we've been doing some work actually around, I'm going to come back to kind of the brand in the market and the branding of police within the market. And we've fallen, I think, a little bit behind. And I don't mean that in terms of, the recruitment team doing an amazing job, but actually as an organisation, investing in what is our proposition to market. And it probably sounds a little bit commercial, but I mean to be commercial. We are in a really highly competitive job market. And actually, when you think about multi-generational, as well as, kind of diversity of the workforce more broadly, there's a lot in there that we need to unpick as an organisation. I think that, at the recruitment point, there's a discussion to be had about some of our practices. And, we have an independent doctor at the moment who's looking at some of the medical restrictions, perhaps, that we put on. There's a question, isn't there, about, some of the fitness test. I asked the question about, why we get people to do a written test when maybe they've got a Nat 5 or a higher in English, So there's pieces there about, and that's not just about inclusion, that's more broadly about the candidate experience. We have to fight to get candidates. This isn't about us just sitting back and thinking, people are going to come to us. We need to present ourselves in the market. So there is that bit for me. I think on flexibility, I think we were about 22% of officers and staff work part-time or compressed hours. It's something in that space. But actually the question for me becomes about what conversations didn't happen for where people perhaps have put in a request or want to work flexibly but don't think they can have the conversation. So I'm back to, if you look at the numbers that work, in a flexible way, that's kind of your expressed piece of your culture. But what's the lived and the shadow culture around that flexibility? I'm going to have to say, I don't, in terms of officers and the flexibility bit, our chair of the people committee asks really good questions about what does it take for every role to be offered up flexibly. And I don't know the answer to that on the officer side. And actually, even in trying to find out how we've got to where we've got to with some of our shift patterns, what does that look like? But the flexibility point for me is that there's an operational, organisational need, isn't there, a requirement in terms of how we do it. Our challenge then is to respond to what's the makeup and the profile of the staff that deliver on that. And I think for officers, it was similar in other organisations I've worked in. Social workers would be the same, or where you have a requirement for shifts and rotas. But as an organisation, how do you build more agility into that so that actually you can plan on a tactical level to make sure that you have the resources required? I don't know all the answers to that for officers yet. I think one thing I'm really conscious of is, and if I can use the language, perhaps the creation of a two-tier workforce where you have traditional corporate services who are lucky enough to benefit from full, flexible, hybrid working. And then you have officers, and of course it comes with the nature of some of the roles, but actually who don't have that. And actually our kind of challenge here as an organisation, because I firmly believe we're one organisation, whether you're an officer or you're a staff member, is how we tell that narrative. So even if there is a different requirement for your job, you still feel that sense of being able to ask if you have something that's coming up around your work-life balance, if you have a change in circumstance. It's that bit about feeling that you have a voice, somebody is listening, and the answer might not be something that you want, but somebody's listened to you and explained to you the rationale as to why that might not be possible.
And I think, our members, when they feed back to us, that's all that they want is, to have that feedback as well, and to have that flexibility to live and to work and to do the job that they love. I know that the SWDF, we look at some of the figures that come out, and obviously that last year there was a dip in recruitment as well for women, which for the first time I think it's 26%. Now, we were looking only a few years ago at 50% female intake. There's a real worry there for us that, what's changed? Is it the institutional discrimination statement? Is it the perception of the police? Because, the police, certainly it can be challenging. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know if I have all of the answers at the moment. I think we're still in a point of kind of discovery, and I don't mean data discovery, but that kind of back to lived experience. And I think what's helpful, or what's good at the moment that's happening in Police Scotland is that there is a conversation happening about that. And in other organisations, they're not even at that point now. They're still kind of in a pretense of just looking at their data and the data tells me. But actually, it's that bit underneath. What we do know is, through exit interviews, which, we need to look at and make that more of a colleague-driven kind of experience rather than a process, is actually, females are more likely to leave at different points in their career. So, regardless of whether it's, a caring responsibility, whatever that might be, the reality is that for all of us throughout our lives, there will be points in our lives when we have an ask of the organisation that will be different. And for an organisation that aspires to create a sense of belonging and wants to retain the talent that we have to be able to respond to that. But we need to be able to respond to it in pace as well. So there's no point in me putting in a flexible working application at a point of, need, and then having to wait 2, 3, 4 months potentially until I get something back. It doesn't work in real life that way, does it? So I don't have all the answers, but what I will say is that we're getting a huge amount of insight that's so important then, that can help with some of the big challenging statements or questions that we have as an organisation around the barriers and the enablers, so that, we can all join up. And I think, we touched on, or we haven't yet, but I'm sure we will, policing together. And actually, for me, that's the opportunity to make the connection across all of the different insights and, all of the wealth of information, knowledge, personal experience that we have across the organisation. How do you pull it together into one space then that tells the narrative of actually what's happening?
Yeah, interestingly, you bring up policing together. That's actually my next question. So as we look forward to the future and consider the theme of inspiring inclusion for International Women's Day, the Policing Together strategy is a cornerstone of Police Scotland's approach to equality, diversity and inclusion. Can you explain how Policing Together is shaping the future of policing in Scotland, and what does that mean for our communities?
So I see Policing Together as our absolute cultural intent as an organisation. And that is the cultural footprint that we have said culturally we aspire to get to. And when I say we, I mean every single person that works in Police Scotland. This is not about one person, one team. This is all of us. Every conversation we have with each other, every kind of working relationship we have, all of those touch points actually create cultural intent and impact. So I see it as our ambition statement about, what it is that we want to feel like for colleagues to join and to work in, and that's reflective externally to people. So when they talk to somebody from Police Scotland, they're getting that absolute, genuine, authentic sense of what our organisation is. So I think that it's embedding, I think, is what I would say. I kind of, think about this flow, if you like, of engaging colleagues in conversation, where you start with an awareness of something. I know something's going on, not quite sure what it is, but I've heard there's something happening, to understanding. So I've had an awareness. I found out more, however that might be. I'm beginning to gain an understanding about it, what it means for me, what it means organisationally. You then move to engaged. I feel engaged in that conversation now. So I've gone from awareness to an understanding to feeling engaged in it. I have a voice in that. I'm being listened to. The organisation is responding to advocacy. And that's a long, hard journey. And I think the reality is we are somewhere still in awareness, perhaps tipping into understanding in parts, but in pockets. So we've still got a long way to go, I think, until you properly move into a space of advocacy.
And it's interesting because I'm about to ask you about the future. And you're talking about that's the end state, isn't it? That advocacy. You could say brand ambassadors, essentially. So I'm interested to understand from your perspective, because you've come from out with policing and all of your experience in industry and public service over the last year of being within this organisation and understanding what it is that we do. What does the future look like to you, and what lessons can you bring from the other sectors that you've worked in?
So I see the future, I'm going to kind of come back to culture again, and that always has to be the end game. For me, you can design an operating model, and I know we kind of to and fro on, some of the operating model principles, etc. But actually, it's the culture that we have to get right. And if you can find a way, for example, culturally, of collegiate collaborative leadership and working together, actually that makes your structural reform so much easier, doesn't it? You kind of come from the same place. So I always come back to that kind of, the leadership and, what that looks and feels like for colleagues. I think in terms of Police Scotland, it's a really challenging landscape, isn't it? Budget is one thing. We've touched on that earlier. It's not going to get easier. And actually, in some ways, certainly my last organisation, they actually looked at Police Scotland almost as being protected in terms of budget. And I suspect there are other public sector organisations that might feel the same. So they have had cuts, in kind of previous in England and Wales. It's been really tough. I mean, you only have to look at the number of local authorities that have or are on the cusp of declaring bankruptcy. That there was something recently that talked about, Scottish local authorities, and I hope I get the percentage right. But was it 33% of them thought they might at one point in the next 5 years have to declare bankruptcy? So, you start to get into a space where you have a driver then in relation to that probably forces us to accelerate some of what we want to do. And I'm not talking structures, but I come back to how we work. So how we collaborate internally, but with partners. So more broadly, what are the working relationships we have? How do we kind of work together to unpick some of the challenges? To your point earlier, Jenny, about, when we fail, then we fail. Let's not continue to invest time, money, resources into things. Let's stop, let's move on and learn from it. So I think, the next 12, 24 months is a massive landscape of change for Police Scotland. But with that does come opportunity. There's no doubt challenges, but it comes with opportunity to continue to think about how we serve best the citizens of Scotland. And actually, what is that citizen experience? What's the colleague experience? So it's that kind of iterative, continual change. So I think, there's a huge amount around structural change, that inevitably will come. We're talking to Scottish Fire about, blue light collaboration and, particularly from a corporate services space, what should we be doing there? And that's only right, we should do that. But it's scary, isn't it? Because you start talking about, roles and structures and things like that. But however, if you flip the coin and you start to say, well, let's get on the front foot of trying to design how that might be, and actually coming back to playing from strengths from organisations or individuals, we could have a tenfold better impact on colleagues. For example, if P&D teams came together, I don't know. But so I think I feel optimistic, but it's very challenging. I personally feel very inspired by our new Chief Constable. I've been lucky enough to spend time with her. I think she has a very values-based leadership style and approach. It's very authentic. She has an incredibly tough job, but I take comfort and confidence in the future that she's laying out for Police Scotland, but recognising that there are some hard decisions for us.
Director Miller, Katy.
Thank you.
Your insights today have been incredibly valuable. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. Thank you for taking the time to share your journey and the important work that you're doing with Police Scotland.
To our listeners, let's take today's conversation as a call to action. Reflect on the importance of diversity and inclusion in leadership, support and promote initiatives that empower women in leadership positions. Together, we can make a difference, not just on International Women's Day, but every day.
This has been a TwaBoldLassies production for the Scottish Women's Development Forum.